subjects, Social Abjection and Resistance in Neoliberal Britain, which was published this year by Zed. During this time, she's been working simultaneously on a number of funded research projects and has collaborated along the way with Sussex's Kerry Ockett over there, among many others. And out of this work, there are a number of other important publications emerging. There's a new edited book out very soon called Immigrant Protest, Politics, Aesthetics and Everyday Dissent by State University of New York Press. And there's also a special issue of Citizenship Studies, ongoing work on immigrant protest, and a special issue in the journal Studies in the Maternal on austerity parenting. Well, I won't take up any more of her time. Imogen's talk today is entitled Naked Protest, Migrant Resistance, Neoliberal Disenfranchisement and the Feminist Commons. Imogen, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much everybody for, shall I sit back a bit more, for coming to see me on this rainy day. It's really nice to have a crowd. So I'm just going to say a few words to begin with about the book. So I'm going to talk out of a chapter of the book, a middle chapter of the book, which is the chapter called Naked Protest. But I'm going to just sort of contextualise the book a little bit to begin with. And I'm going to read this paper, but I'll try and talk a little bit as well, just because it's quite a complicated paper, and I tried to talk it once before and it all fell apart. It's like a complicated jigsaw. So to remember all the parts, I kind of need to read it like a story. So we're living through, as we all know, an incredibly turbulent period in world history, in which man-made catastrophes, environmental change, peak oil, terror, warfare, global economic recession are kind of converging with ruinous consequences that we're seeing kind of on the ground in Britain and, of course, very much so elsewhere. Some of the sociologists in my department say that we're now entering into a period of deglobalisation. We'll talk about what that might mean. But in Revolting Subjects, I try and think about the state we're in, and by that, in particular, I'm thinking about the British state, but I'm also kind of thinking about state-making as well, and the state we're in kind of more individually or collectively, politically, as groups. And in Britain, and Britain is the focus of Revolting Subjects, although this talk takes us way outside of Britain, but Britain is the kind of case study or where I begin to think from. Britain has ostensibly been the beneficiary of the kind of epochal shift from industrial modes of capital to neoliberal modes of capital and neoliberal modes of governmentality. But of course what we know is that neoliberal economic and ideological policies and practices actually have been creating greater and deepening inequalities within this state. And Henry Giroux describes the forms of political governance which have emerged around kind of neoliberal economics as a politics of disposability, in which, quote, poor minorities of colour and class, unable to contribute to the prevailing consumerist ethic, are vanishing into the sinkhole of poverty in desolate and abandoned enclaves of decaying cities and rural spaces. And this theme is taken up by other thinkers like Bauman, who writes about kind of wasted lives, his book Wasted Lives, about wasted humans within and at the border of sovereign territories. It's a kind of the condition or the major symptom or characteristic of a kind of neoliberal modes of government. We go back a bit further to the 70s and to sort of Foucault's last lectures and the birth of biopolitics. We find him offering us an account of, I think, really quite amazingly, of what was going to be unleashed subsequently, about what he describes as a kind of state-phobic consensus which emerged after the Second World War. So he kind of talks about the Second World War, the horrors of kind of Nazism, how Europe starts to collectively think about what the way forward is on the political left or political right after that, and what emerges is a consensus on the left and the right that the state itself is the problem, like a big state. The big state is the problem, that government can be too powerful, the state can be too powerful, and the big state is a kind of enemy of human freedom. And in the kind of midst of this anxiety argument about the kind of fascistic potential of the big state, we get a kind of move to deregulation of centralised state controls, a fear of bureaucracy is that which we must get rid of, and the work of governments, you know, and of course after the Second World War we get the building of the welfare state, but at the same time Foucault's arguing what we also get is the beginnings of this process of the work of government being about undoing bureaucracy as well, undoing the state becomes the work of the state. And undoing the state, Foucault argues, is about creating the conditions in which the state can be more thoroughly capitalised by big business. So big business is seen, or the corporation or consumer culture is seen as a kind of way to stop state being too powerful. And there's a quote which I like. Instead of accepting a free market divided by the state and kept, as it were, under state supervision, which was in a way the initial formula of liberalism, let us establish a space of economic freedom, and let us circumscribe it by a state which will supervise it, a state under the supervision of the market rather than the market supervised by the state. So this isn't what Foucault thinks is what he thinks is happening, not what he believes. But what we know is the power of states isn't shrunk. So I think the kind of myth, for me, a theoretical myth of the last decade, is the idea that states, or the power of states, are shrunk in this process. So a lot of the theorising that's gone on around state formation has emphasised the transnational level, and it's also emphasised kind of the local, and talked about, for example, global politics. But I think there's a mistake there, because I don't think the power of the state does get shrunk in this process. What happens rather is the kind of modes of power hybridise and shift and change and multiply. And in a way my book's kind of Revolt Subject speaks to that. It speaks to the shift, what the forms of governance are that operate at the level of the state, or at least it begins with Britain. So what I'm trying to do in Revolting Subjects is offer a kind of new conceptual framework for thinking through these conditions of crisis. And I call this conceptual framework social abjection and revolt, are the two conceptual frameworks that I use. And I tell a series of what I call political parables. Somebody told me off who didn't like that, because it made it sound like it wasn't true. There's real research or ethnographic research as well that underpins this book. But I actually kind of like the idea of I've chosen particular stories to tell about the state we're in, and parable is a kind of term for me that's quite important. Okay. So what drives the book is this kind of political concern really about this context and how we think about it. And also to try and practice a form of intersectionality. So what tends to happen, and it happens because of the way, and we're just talking about the way disciplines are organised in Sussex, every university organises them differently, but it's that we don't talk to each other. People work on class, they work on migration, they work on sexual politics, but there's, you know, in institutional forms stop people from having conversations about the commonalities, and the other theme of this book is about trying to think about the commonalities. I'll get to that in the paper, but in a way it's trying to de-fetishise a little bit an emphasis on difference. And that sounds very provocative thing to say, but I'll throw it out there. And it's trying to think about what is common to these conditions of disenfranchisement that we need to think together. And it's going back really to this sort of 70s feminist work, and black feminist work in particular, on intersections and the intersections of different forms and systems of power and oppression. how do you think about them together? And the book attempts to do that. So there's a story about the book when I sent it out to Zed, to the publisher, and the book proposal, they sent it out to a reviewer, and they said, God, this would be a great book, but no one could write this book because it's too much. It's too many areas to write about in a book, and actually it was kind of true. It kind of was a bit like that in the end, but there's an attempt in the book to precisely write about class, to write about gypsies and travellers, to write about migrants, asylum seekers, and to try and think of a framework, to think of those different forms, and they are different, but to think them together in relationship to kind of neoliberalism. So that's the kind of me talking, just that's it now, done, about the book. And this is a chapter from the book that I'm going to speak to now, which is right in the middle of the book, and it's where I realised you can't stick with one state, because the state we're in isn't just a state, a geographical, place. Britain isn't just the British Isles. Britain is a history, it's got a colonial history, and it's got a migratory history that inevitably, as soon as you begin to study or think about what Britain is, takes us outside of this place to other places. Okay, I've done that. So I'm going to begin with three. I'll come back to this. This is protest. I'll come back to coping, protesting against the oil spill in the Texan Gulf. I'm going to begin with three quotations. First quotation is an activist in the Niger Delta talking in 2005. We'll go naked. We'll do our naked because you people want us to suffer. We're not taking that. Fear will come. This quote is Mercy Gwabida, who is a protester in Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre, talking to a journalist. I took off my clothes because they treat us like animals. We are claiming asylum, we're not animals. And the third quote is from the image you just saw that I'm going to come back to. I'm going to end the paper with is Diane Wilson, who's the founder of Code Pink, who are an activist organisation, feminist and peace organisation in the US. Expose BP, expose that drill, baby. Drill means spill. Baby spill. After all, what's at stake is nothing less than our planet, and that's the naked truth. And this paper is going to tell the story that is going to weave together these three protesters, and hopefully also come up with a theory of a feminist commons, or call for a theory of a feminist commons, whereby we start to think things together that we wouldn't automatically, or we perhaps don't think together because of the disciplinary effects of disciplines, partly, and knowledge formation. So in 2011, Silvia Federici argued for a feminist commons. And for those of you who don't know her, she was a kind of pivotal Italian feminist who lives in the US now, although worked in Nigeria for a long time, who was a pivotal figure in Wages for Housework, Marxist feminist from the 70s, and has continued to, she's becoming fashionable again now, but she's been an extremely marginal figure in academic knowledge production. But in this online magazine called The Commoner, that some of you might know, she called for a feminist commons to respond to what she describes as the democratic deficits, the staggering economic inequalities and laissez-faire violence which are central to Operation Neoliberal Globalism. And in a way, this chapter of the book is an attempt to think about what that might mean. What might it mean to respond to this call for women to collectively mobilise themselves, to mobilise their bodies, to take back space, public space. And when I was writing this chapter, it was when Occupy was still happening, and which one it still is to some extent, and also it's when things were really kicking off and people were very optimistic about what's happening in North Africa and the Middle East.